A cozy dinner party turned deadly. Can you solve the mystery before Miss Marple does? The night had settled over the countryside estate, casting long shadows across the elegant drawing room. Mrs. Evelyn White, a gracious and warm-hearted hostess, had invited a select group of friends and family for an intimate dinner party. The air was filled with the clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of polite conversation, but beneath the surface, an invisible tension lingered. Among the guests was the sharp-eyed and perceptive Miss Marple, a woman whose quiet demeanor concealed a mind always alert to the smallest of details. The grand mansion, with its creaking floorboards and dusty corners, seemed almost to hold its breath, as though it too knew that something sinister was about to unfold. Just as the conversation reached a pleasant lull, a shrill scream pierced the air, sharp, desperate, and full of terror. The room fell into immediate silence. Every face turned pale. Every smile vanished. It was the sort of scream that froze the blood in one's veins, a scream that said more than words ever could. The guests rushed to the source of the scream, the library, a room that had long been a place of mystery itself. The door, which had been firmly shut just moments before, was now slightly ajar, as though someone had hurriedly entered or exited. Mrs. White's breath caught in her throat as she pushed open the door, her heart pounding. Inside, they found the lifeless body of Simon Carrington, a man who had always seemed as charming as he was enigmatic. His body was sprawled across the floor, his eyes wide open, staring into the void with a look of absolute terror frozen on his face. Clutched in his hand was a single object, a silver pocket watch, its glass face cracked, its hand strangely set to 11:47. But what made the scene truly baffling was that the room was locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry or exit. No one could have entered or left without being seen. A cold shiver ran down the spines of everyone present. How could this be? The door had been locked, the windows were all secured, and the walls held no secret passageways. The room was a puzzle that no one could yet solve. As the guests stood there, stunned and speechless, Miss Marple remained strangely calm, observing the scene with the quiet intensity of someone who had seen much darker things in her time. Her sharp eyes flicked over the room, noting the small details others might have missed. The faint scratch on the desk, the half-empty glass of wine, and most importantly, the tense, nervous glances exchanged among the guests. Then, in the midst of the chaos, when everyone was scrambling for answers, Miss Marple spoke, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension like a knife. "The answer lies in human nature," she said softly, "not in locked doors." Her words hung in the air, so simple, yet so profound. The room fell silent once more, the weight of her observations sinking in. Could it really be true? Was it possible that the key to this impossible murder lay not in the locked door, but in the people standing before her, in their actions, their motives, their fears? Everyone exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly unsure who to trust. Was one of them the murderer, hiding behind a mask of innocence? Could it be that the crime wasn't as simple as a locked room mystery after all? Miss Marple's eyes moved from face to face, her mind already turning, already calculating. She knew that there was more to this than met the eye. Every word, every gesture, every subtle shift in a person's expression could hold the answer. But as the guests nervously whispered among themselves, one thing was certain. The mystery had only just begun, and the clock was ticking. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was far closer than they could ever imagine. Cliffhanger ending. The tension in the room thickens as Miss Marple calmly turns to face the group once more, her eyes sharp with an unsettling certainty. "The murderer is among us," she says, "and they believe they are already one step ahead." With that, the room goes cold. The chilling realization settles in that no one is safe. The story had just begun, and already everyone's lives were hanging in the balance. The investigation begins, the search for clues. The room was tense, Every pair of eyes was fixed on Miss Marple, who stood in the center of the drawing room, her expression calm yet calculating. The air was thick with confusion, fear, and suspicion as the guests, still shaken by Simon Carrington's brutal murder, tried to make sense of what had happened. How could someone die in a locked room? It seemed impossible. And yet, the body was real. The terror in his eyes was real. The fear was real. The group, now visibly uneasy, gathered around the room in small, tight clusters, muttering amongst themselves. Mrs. Evelyn White, pale and distraught, hovered near the fireplace, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Sophie, Simon's business partner, stood by the window, staring out into the dark night, as if the shadows outside held the answers. Lucy, the young daughter of the hostess, sat quietly on the edge of a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her wide eyes darting nervously from person to person. And then there was Charles, Simon's former lover, pacing back and forth, his face a mask of barely contained anger and jealousy. Every now and then, his eyes would flick toward Sophie, narrowing with suspicion, before quickly shifting away. Then there was Thomas, the servant. Ever silent, always in the background, he stood near the door, watching the group with an unreadable expression. His stillness was unnerving, his lack of reaction to the situation almost too perfect. Miss Marple observed them all, her sharp eyes taking in every small detail, every twitch of the eye, every subtle shift in body language. While the others argued vehemently about the impossible nature of the crime. It's absurd. No one could have entered or left. Miss Marple remained quiet, her mind whirring like clockwork. She didn't speak yet, but every movement, every word, every gesture was being filed away in her mind. She stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. Let's start with the basics, shall we? We need to understand who Simon was, what he meant to each of you, and perhaps more importantly, what secrets you might be hiding. The group fell silent. Charles's lips pressed together in a thin line, Sophie's fingers drummed nervously on the windowsill, and Lucy's breath caught in her throat. Thomas didn't move. Miss Marple looked around the room slowly, her eyes lingering just a moment longer on each of them. She could feel the tension simmering just below the surface. There was something they weren't saying. Something they wanted to hide. It wasn't until she noticed the small detail on the desk that she spoke again. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority. She bent down to pick up a silver pocket watch, which had been left on the desk, beside a scattered pile of papers. The watch, Simon's, was still ticking, its delicate hands frozen at an odd time 11:47. It seemed insignificant at first, just a small detail, in an already baffling scene, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "You know," she said, her gaze steady as she looked at the group, "people often leave a timestamp when they're not as careful as they think. And this," she held the watch up for everyone to see, "this, I believe, is one such clue." Simon clearly did not expect anyone to pay attention to the time, but here it is right in front of us. The guests shifted uneasily, unsure of what to make of her words. Charles clenched his jaw. Sophie's gaze flickered away. Lucy's hands tightened into fists, and Thomas merely watched from the corner of the room, his eyes dark and unreadable. 11:47 分. Miss Marple repeated, almost to herself, the exact moment the crime was likely committed. But why? Why would Simon leave his watch behind, ticking away like that, at such a precise time? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Was it a message? Was Simon trying to tell them something before he died? Miss Marple's voice softened as she turned toward the group. "You see, this murder, it's not as impossible as it seems. It's simply a matter of human nature. And people often make mistakes when they think they have the upper hand." She paused, letting her words sink in, watching as the guests shifted uneasily in their seats. Her gaze lingered on each of them, and it became clear to her that the true mystery was not the locked door or the impossible crime scene, it was the people standing before her. Each one of them had something to hide, and Miss Marple was determined to find out what it was. Cliffhanger ending. Just as Miss Marple was about to delve deeper into her observations, Charles suddenly stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "What do you mean by that?" he demanded, his voice trembling with emotion. "Are you accusing me of something?" The room went silent. Miss Marple's calm demeanor never wavered, but her eyes gleamed with an intensity that made the others shift uncomfortably. "The truth, Charles," she said softly, "always comes to light, no matter how carefully you try to hide it." Before anyone could react, a loud crash came from the hallway, followed by the sound of footsteps running. The door to the drawing room swung open, and standing in the doorway was Thomas, his face ghostly pale. "Tu saw something," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I know who did it." The suspects, uncovering the secrets. The tension in the room was palpable. The group had gathered around the fireplace, their faces pale and drawn, the heavy air of suspicion thickening with each passing second. Miss Marple, poised and serene, remained silent for a moment longer as she observed the guests, each one of them hiding something, each one of them a potential murderer. Charles, jealous lover. Charles, standing near the mantel, shifted uncomfortably as Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching at his side, as though trying to hide an unspoken emotion. His relationship with Simon had always been complicated, a tangled mess of love, anger, and jealousy. Miss Marple had already noticed the way his eyes flickered towards Sophie whenever her name was mentioned. It was the look of a man who had once loved someone, only to have his affections twisted into bitter resentment. "You were very close to Simon, weren't you?" Miss Marple's voice broke the silence, her tone gentle, but sharp as ever. Charles cleared his throat, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Yes, we were, but that was in the past, and the past is not important now. What matters is the fact that Simon is dead." But Miss Marple wasn't so easily convinced. A man who is deeply hurt by jealousy doesn't let go so easily, does he, Charles? A cold shiver ran through the room. Was there something he wasn't admitting? Miss Marple turned to the others, her eyes flickering back to Charles. "Do you have an alibi for the time of death, Charles? Where were you when Simon's life was being extinguished?" Charles hesitated for a fraction of a second, a telltale sign that even he wasn't fully prepared for such a pointed question. "I was in the garden," he muttered. I needed air." But his voice lacked conviction. Was it really that simple? "Sophie, business partner." Sophie stood by the window, staring out into the darkened night as if seeking some sort of escape. She had been Simon's business partner, a sharp and calculating woman, but things had changed in recent weeks. Simon had grown distant, and rumors swirled that he was planning to cut her out of a lucrative business deal. Was that enough to push her to violence? Miss Marple's keen eyes never left Sophie as she approached the group. "Sophie, you've known Simon for quite some time. His recent actions must have been troubling for you." Sophie stiffened, her lips curling into a small, defensive smile. "He wasn't a saint," she replied, her voice tight. "But we had an agreement, and I don't break my promises." "Then why was he planning to cut you out of the deal?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice carrying an unspoken accusation. "Wasn't that enough to make you angry or desperate?" Sophie's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Miss Marple caught a flash of something dangerous flicker behind her composed exterior. Sophie took a breath, her eyes flicking to the others. "That's between Simon and me. He wasn't perfect, but I wouldn't kill him." Miss Marple nodded, but her gaze never wavered from Sophie. "People do strange things when they're backed into a corner, Sophie." Lucy, shy daughter. Lucy, the quiet daughter of the hostess, sat off to the side, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with her dress. Her pale face, framed by soft golden curls, appeared innocent, almost fragile. Yet there was something in her nervous demeanor that didn't quite fit. She was too quiet, too compliant. The slightest movement in the room seemed to make her jump, and Miss Marple noted how Lucy's eyes darted away every time someone mentioned the murder. "Lucy," Miss Marple asked gently, her voice laced with curiosity, "where were you when Simon was attacked?" Lucy swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "2 was in my room," she replied, almost too quickly. "I was reading." Her response seemed rehearsed, and the way she refused to meet Miss Marple's gaze only deepened the suspicion. Miss Marple knew all too well that appearances could be deceiving. "You are very young, Lucy," she said softly. "But people are often driven by strange motivations. Can you think of any reason why someone might want to hurt Simon?" Lucy's lips quivered as she shook her head. "No, I can't imagine." Miss Marple could see the cracks beginning to form, the edges of Lucy's carefully constructed mask starting to unravel. What was she hiding? Miss Marple pressed no further, but she knew her intuition would lead her to the truth. Thomas, quiet servant. And then there was Thomas, the ever-present servant, the man who had worked loyally for the White family for years. He was always in the background, blending into the house like a shadow. But his silence today was too calculated. Why had he remained so passive? Why had he stayed out of the investigation when everyone else was being questioned? "Thomas," Miss Marple said, turning to him with an air of gentle authority. "You've been with the family for many years. Surely you must have noticed something out of the ordinary last night. Anything unusual?" Thomas remained still, his eyes locked on the floor, his face unreadable. "No, Miss Marple," he replied, his voice low and steady. "I didn't hear anything. I don't know anything about the crime." Miss Marple studied him carefully. There was something off about his insistence on staying out of the investigation. Why was he so adamant? "Tell me, Thomas," she asked, her voice soft but sharp. "Why are you so eager to stay out of this? What don't you want us to know?" For the first time, Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching slightly at his sides. His eyes flickered toward the others in the room. There was fear there, a fear that spoke of secrets buried far deeper than anyone could guess. Twist. Miss Marple paused, letting the silence settle over the group like a thick fog. The guests shifted nervously, unsure of how to react to her calm yet piercing analysis. She took a step forward, her gaze sweeping over each one of them. "You see," Miss Marple said softly, "people often underestimate what the mind can hide when it's pressured. It's easy to assume that someone will break under scrutiny. But sometimes, the most powerful secrets are hidden beneath the most still surfaces." She allowed her words to hang in the air, each person in the room now questioning not only their own actions, but the actions of everyone else. Cliffhanger ending. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud thud from upstairs. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the staircase. The sound was unmistakable. It was the heavy thump of something for someone falling. Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, but the tension in the room reached a boiling point. "I believe," Miss Marple said softly, her voice like ice, "that someone is trying to send us a message. Perhaps we should see what it is." As everyone rushed toward the stairs, the last thing they saw was Thomas, his face drained of color, standing frozen in place. His hands clenched tight, as though holding on to something that could very well be the key to the entire mystery. The midpoint, revelations and new discoveries. The study was eerily quiet, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Miss Marple sat in Simon's leather armchair, her keen eyes focused on the lifeless body before her. The others had reluctantly left the room, giving her a moment alone. Her fingers delicately traced the fabric of Simon's jacket, as if she were searching for something intangible in answer, perhaps to the question that hung heavy in the air. Why had Simon been killed? Her hands paused suddenly. There it was, a faint bulge in the inner lining of his jacket. With the precision of someone accustomed to uncovering the hidden truths of human nature, she retrieved a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age but meticulously preserved. The room seemed to darken as she unfolded the letter, her sharp mind already piecing together possibilities. The writing was hurried, the ink smudged in places, as though Simon had been in a rush or in fear when he'd written it. Her eyes scanned the words, and her breath hitched slightly at their weight. To the one who finds this, know that I could no longer remain silent. The lies have grown too heavy, the sins too dark to ignore. Someone here has a secret, and I will not rest until the truth is known. By the time this reaches you, I may already be gone. But beware of those who smile too easily. Betrayal often hides behind a kind face. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Simon. Miss Marple's brows furrowed. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, nor did it name the person whose secret Simon was intent on exposing. But the clues were there: blackmail, betrayal, and danger. The phrase, "a kind face," echoed in her mind. She glanced toward the door, her thoughts now racing. The hidden connection. The letter was a revelation, but also a riddle. What dark secret had Simon uncovered, and who among the guests had been desperate enough to silence him? The pieces were starting to form a pattern, but there were still too many gaps. Miss Marple's sharp instincts told her that this was just the beginning of the storm. As she folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket, she heard a soft creak from behind her. Her heart didn't race. Miss Marple was far too composed for that, but her senses heightened. Turning slowly, she saw Thomas, the quiet servant, standing in the doorway, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. "You've been standing there for some time, haven't you, Thomas?" she said, her voice calm but firm. Thomas hesitated, his eyes darting to the folded letter in her hand. I came to see if you needed anything, miss." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what do you think Simon needed, Thomas? Surely you must have noticed his unease these past few days. It's difficult to keep secrets in a house like this." Thomas's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might speak. But instead, he merely bowed his head and muttered, "I wouldn't know, miss. I only do as I am told." Before she could press him further, a sudden noise shattered the quiet. A loud crash from the drawing room. Miss Marple's head snapped toward the sound, and Thomas stiffened, his expression one of barely concealed panic. "Stay here," Miss Marple said firmly, though she doubted he would listen. She hurried toward the source of the commotion, her mind already churning through possibilities. Cliffhanger ending. When she entered the drawing room, the sight before her made her stop in her tracks. The glass display case that had once held Simon's prized antique clock was shattered, shards glittering like frozen tears on the floor. But that wasn't what held her attention. At the center of the room stood Charles, his face pale, his hands trembling as he held something in his grasp, a second letter, crumpled as though it had been snatched in haste. "Where did you get that?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as sharp as a knife. Charles looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. "Found it hidden in the cabinet," he stammered. It says someone here killed Simon to keep their secret hidden." Miss Marple took a step closer, her gaze locked on the letter. But before she could take it from him, the lights flickered ominously and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The room erupted into chaos: footsteps, whispers, a muffled scream, and then, just as suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The room was empty. Charles was gone. And in his place, on the shattered glass, lay the crumpled letter, its edges stained with fresh blood. Dangerous move. The confrontation. The tension in the room was palpable, like a storm cloud ready to burst. Miss Marple sat quietly in her corner, knitting needles clicking softly in the silence, but her mind was far from the mundane rhythm of her craft. She had been watching Charles ever since the discovery of the second letter, his behavior growing increasingly erratic. His hands trembled as he poured himself another glass of whiskey, spilling a few drops onto the polished table. "Not quite your usual calm self, are you, Charles?" Miss Marple's voice was soft but cutting, her eyes sharp as they flicked up to meet his. Charles froze, the glass hovering halfway to his lips. The other guests turned to look at him, the weight of Miss Marple's question settling heavily in the air. "I don't know what you are implying," Charles said, his voice taut, his jaw clenched. "A man's allowed to be shaken after what's happened. We've all lost a friend tonight, haven't we?" "Friend," Miss Marple repeated, her tone thoughtful. "It's an interesting choice of word, considering the animosity you shared with Simon not so long ago. I recall you had a rather heated disagreement at the garden party last month, didn't you? Something about money, if I am not mistaken." Charles slammed the glass down, the sharp crack echoing through the room. "That was nothing, just a misunderstanding," he snapped, his face flushing red. "Misunderstandings can lead to all sorts of unfortunate consequences," Miss Marple continued calmly, her gaze unwavering. "And yet, here we are, with Simon dead, and secrets bubbling to the surface like water from a broken well. Don't you think it's time we all stopped pretending?" Charles's hand curled into a fist, and for a moment it looked as though he might lose control entirely. The other guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between him and Miss Marple. "You think you are so clever, don't you?" Charles said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. He leaned forward, his eyes blazing with barely concealed rage. "Poking your nose into things that don't concern you. But let me tell you something. Miss Marple, you have no idea what you are dealing with here." The room fell into a tense silence, the only sound the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch, her hands resting in her lap. But her expression didn't waver. If anything, her calm demeanor only seemed to unnerve Charles further. "Perhaps I don't," she said quietly. "But I do know this. People often reveal more than they intend when they're angry. And you, Charles, seem to be carrying a very heavy burden. Is it guilt, I wonder, or fear?" Charles took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "You are treading on dangerous ground, old woman," he spat. "Be careful. You might not like what you find." The threat hung in the air like a noose tightening around the room. Before anyone could respond, a loud crash shattered the moment. Everyone turned toward the sound, their hearts pounding. The source was the small china cabinet in the corner, where a vase had fallen and shattered into pieces on the floor. Charles used the distraction to his advantage. Without another word, he stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Cliffhanger ending. Miss Marple remained seated, her expression thoughtful as the guests murmured anxiously among themselves. She picked up her knitting again, the soft clicking of the needles almost soothing in the tense atmosphere. "I wonder," she said softly, almost to herself, "if the answers we seek are not in Simon's life, but in his death. People hide much in life, but in death, the truth often comes to the surface. Wouldn't you agree, Sophie?" Sophie flinched at the sudden attention, her eyes widening in surprise. But before she could respond, the lights flickered ominously, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the lights came back on, Miss Marple was gone, and so was the letter she had been keeping in her pocket. The twist, the hidden passageway. The library was eerily silent, the air thick with tension. The guests stood in a semicircle, their eyes darting nervously as Miss Marple ran her fingers along the spines of the books on the towering shelf. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were tracing the threads of an invisible web. "I've always found," she murmured, her voice breaking the stillness, "that old houses carry more than just memories. They carry secrets hidden in their very bones." Her fingers paused on a worn leather-bound volume. The title faded with age. She tilted her head, studying it with an intensity that made everyone lean in just a little closer. Then, with a sharp tug, she pulled the book outward. The sound of a faint click echoed through the room. For a moment, nothing happened. The group exchanged confused glances, their unease growing. But then, with a low groan, the entire bookshelf began to shift. Slowly, it swung outward, revealing a narrow, dark passageway hidden behind it. Gasps filled the room as the group took a collective step back. The passage was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, its walls lined with ancient stone and cobwebs. A faint, musty smell wafted out, carrying with it the weight of something long forgotten. "Good heavens," Mrs. Evelyn White whispered, clutching the pearls around her neck. "I've lived in this house for decades and never knew this was here." Miss Marple turned to her, her expression thoughtful. "Curious, isn't it? A secret passage in the very room where Simon was found. One that isn't on the estate's blueprints, yet clearly designed for someone to come and go unnoticed." Charles, standing near the doorway, let out a nervous laugh. "Surely you are not suggesting someone used this to commit murder?" Miss Marple finished for him, her gaze sharp. "I suggest nothing, Mr. Charles. I merely observe." The group crowded around the opening, their faces pale with a mix of fear and curiosity. Sophie clung to the edge of the desk, her knuckles white, while Lucy peered into the darkness with wide, fearful eyes. "Who would have known about this passage?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the opening, her gaze sweeping over the stone walls as if they might whisper their secrets to her. She reached out, running her fingers along the edge of the passageway, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Someone who knew the house intimately," she finally said. "Someone who either lived here or spent enough time here to discover its hidden veins. Secrets like these don't reveal themselves easily." Thomas, the quiet servant, shifted uncomfortably in the background. "There are many things in old houses that are best left undisturbed," he muttered, barely audible. His comment drew sharp glances from the group, but he avoided their eyes, retreating further into the shadows. Miss Marple turned to face the others. "I wonder," she said softly, "if Simon knew about this passage, or if it was used to catch him unawares." Suddenly, Lucy let out a small cry, drawing everyone's attention. "Tahir is something there," she stammered, pointing into the passageway. "Something moving." The group froze, their eyes straining to see into the darkness. A faint rustling sound came from deep within the passage, like the shuffle of feet on stone. The tension in the room became unbearable, each second stretching into an eternity. "Stay back," Charles said, his voice firm as he stepped forward, grabbing a nearby candlestick as a makeshift weapon. "I'll check it out." "That won't be necessary," Miss Marple interjected, holding up a hand. Her voice was calm, but there was a note of urgency beneath it. "If someone's hiding in there, they won't stay hidden for long. The truth always finds a way to the surface." But before anyone could respond, the rustling grew louder. And then, with a sudden whoosh, a figure burst from the shadows of the passageway, knocking over a stack of books as they fled into the room. Gasps and screams erupted as the figure darted past the group and disappeared through the main library door before anyone could react. The room descended into chaos, everyone talking at once. "Who was that?" Evelyn cried, clutching her chest. "Was it the murderer? Were they hiding in there all along?" Miss Marple remained still, her expression unreadable. "Whoever it was," she said quietly, "they were desperate to escape. And desperation, my dear Mrs. White, often leaves clues in its wake." Cliffhanger ending. As the group calmed down, Sophie pointed toward the passage. "Tahir is something on the floor," she said hesitantly. Miss Marple bent down, her sharp eyes catching the glint of something metallic in the dim light. She picked it up, revealing a small, ornate key covered in dust. "This," she murmured, turning it over in her hand, "doesn't belong to the library. The question is, what door does it open?" The group exchanged uneasy glances, their imaginations running wild. Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered ominously, plunging the room into brief darkness. When they came back on, the key was gone from Miss Marple's hand. The room fell into stunned silence as they realized that someone among them had just taken it. The final act, the trap is set. The drawing room of the old estate was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn against the encroaching night. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the gathered suspects. Tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, each person seated around the room visibly on edge. Miss Marple, calm and composed, stood at the center, her knitting needles in hand, a serene figure, amidst the chaos she was about to unleash. "My dear friends," she began, her voice soft yet commanding, "I've called you all here because I believe the time has come to put an end to this dreadful affair. Simon's death was no accident, nor was it a random act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated crime that, I fear, was born out of love, betrayal, and desperation." The room erupted in a flurry of whispers and exchanged glances. Sophie clutched her hands tightly in her lap, her face pale. Charles leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched, while Lucy sat quietly, her wide eyes darting nervously between the others. Thomas, the quiet servant, stood in the corner, his head bowed, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple raised a hand, and the room fell silent. "Let us begin," she said, her eyes sweeping over the group. "The key to this puzzle lies in Simon's watch that was deliberately set to a specific time, 10:15 p.m. At first glance, it seemed like a minor detail, but as I delved deeper, I realized it was Simon's way of leaving us a clue." She turned her gaze to Sophie. "You, my dear, were Simon's business partner and closest confidant, yet your relationship was far from harmonious, wasn't it? Simon had planned to cut you out of a lucrative deal loan that would have left you with nothing." Sophie's lips trembled, but she held her head high. "I may have been angry, but I would never kill him," she said, her voice steady. "I loved him despite everything." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, love can sometimes breed resentment, can it not?" Before Sophie could respond, Miss Marple turned her attention to Charles. "You, Mr. Charles, had a complicated history with Simon. Jealousy and rivalry have a way of festering over the years. I couldn't help but notice how defensive you've been throughout this investigation." Charles stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "Are you accusing me, Miss Marple? I have no reason to harm Simon. Whatever grievances we had were long in the past." Miss Marple tilted her head, her sharp eyes boring into him. "Perhaps. But past grievances often have a way of resurfacing, don't they?" The room grew colder, the fire's warmth seemingly unable to cut through the tension. Miss Marple's gaze finally landed on Thomas, who stood motionless, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "And then there's you, Thomas," she said quietly. "The loyal servant who has been with this family for years. You've always been in the background, unnoticed, unassuming. But I've come to learn that still waters often run the deepest." Thomas's head snapped up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Me?" he stammered. I don't know what you are talking about, Miss Marple." "Oh, but I think you do," she replied, her voice soft but unyielding. "You see, Thomas, it was your actions that gave you away. You were in love with Sophie, weren't you? A love that was never returned because her heart belonged to Simon." Thomas's face turned ashen, and the room erupted in shocked gasps. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "That's not true," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "I cared for her, yes, but I would never hurt anyone." Miss Marple took a step closer, her piercing gaze never leaving his face. "But you did, Thomas. In a moment of rage and heartbreak, you used the hidden passageway to sneak into the library, confront Simon, and, well, the rest is history, isn't it?" Thomas's hands trembled, his facade crumbling. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I just wanted to talk to him, to make him understand. But he laughed at me, called me pathetic. I couldn't take it. I lost control." The room fell deathly silent, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. But Miss Marple wasn't finished. "And the watch," she pressed. "Why set it to 10:15? Thomas hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. Finally he spoke. "He was wearing it when it happened. I didn't set it. He must have done it himself right before, as if he knew someone would find it." Miss Marple's expression softened, a trace of sadness flickering in her eyes. "He did know," she said gently. "Simon was clever, even in his final moments. He wanted us to know the truth." As the weight of her words sank in, Thomas sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands. The others watched in stunned silence, the gravity of the revelation leaving them speechless. Cliffhanger ending. But just as the room seemed to settle, a sharp knock echoed through the drawing room door. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. The butler stepped forward hesitantly and opened the door. A uniformed officer entered, holding a small envelope. "This just arrived for you, Miss Marple," he said, handing it to her. Miss Marple took the envelope, her brows knitting together in curiosity. She opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. Her expression darkened, and she folded the letter carefully before slipping it into her pocket. "What is it?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "What does it say?" Miss Marple looked up, her expression unreadable. "It appears," she said quietly, "that this case may not be as closed as we thought." The climax, the final reveal and reflection. The drawing room felt heavier than ever, as if the air itself was burdened by the weight of truth. All eyes were on Thomas, who sat slumped in the chair, his face buried in his trembling hands. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to faint embers, casting long shadows across the room. No one spoke, no one moved, as the echoes of his confession still lingered in the air. Miss Marple, standing steady amidst the silence, finally broke the spell. "Thomas," she said softly, her voice a mix of sternness and sympathy. "To hear is nothing more to hide now. Let them hear it. Let them hear why." Thomas slowly raised his head, his face pale and streaked with tears. His voice cracked as he began. "It wasn't supposed to end like this. I didn't plan it. I loved Sophie. I loved her more than anything. But she only saw me as the servant, the quiet one in the corner. And then Simon, he took her away from me. He humiliated me every chance he got. That night, I couldn't take it anymore." His voice faltered, and he gripped the edges of the chair as if it were the only thing grounding him. "I found the passage by accident, months ago. It was my little secret, my escape when things got too much. That night, I saw Sophie and Simon arguing in the library. He was shouting at her, calling her a liar, saying he'd expose her secrets to everyone. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't let him hurt her. So I waited until he was alone." The room was deathly still as Thomas continued, his words raw and unfiltered. "I thought, maybe if I scared him, he'd leave her alone. But when I confronted him, he just laughed. He said she would never love someone like me. He said I was nothing. I don't even remember grabbing the paperweight. It just happened." Thomas's voice broke completely, and he buried his face in his hands again. Sophie let out a quiet sob, while Charles and Lucy exchanged uneasy glances. The reality of what had unfolded in their once peaceful estate was almost too much to bear. Miss Marple stepped closer, her expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. "You thought you could create an impossible crime, didn't you, Thomas?" she said gently. "A locked room, no witnesses, no evidence to point back to you. But you forgot one thing. There's no such thing as a perfect crime. It's always the small human mistakes that unravel everything." Thomas looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "The watch," he murmured. "It was the watch, wasn't it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Simon's watch. You didn't notice that it had stopped when he fell, did you? It gave us the exact time of the struggle. Combined with the footprints near the hidden passage and the soot on your gloves from the fireplace, the pieces came together. You tried so hard to cover your tracks, Thomas, but it's always the little details that tell the story. The room remained silent, the weight of Miss Marple's words settling over everyone. Finally, the sound of footsteps broke the stillness as the constable entered, his hat in hand. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "we're ready to take him." Thomas rose slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As he was led away, he glanced back at Sophie, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and longing. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." Sophie turned away, tears streaming down her face. The door closed behind Thomas, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. Miss Marple's reflection. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat alone in the library, the room now eerily quiet without the tension and accusations that had filled it hours earlier. The fire had been stoked again, its warmth providing little comfort as she stared thoughtfully at Simon's watch resting on the table before her. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. "Murder," she murmured to herself, "is not a puzzle to be solved with locks and keys, my dear. It's always about the people behind it, their passions, their fears, their flaws. They think they can outsmart the truth, but the truth has a way of finding its way through the cracks." She leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the bookshelves lining the room. The hidden passage was now sealed off, but its presence still seemed to linger, a silent reminder of the secrets this house had harbored. As the clock on the mantelpiece struck midnight, Miss Marple let out a sigh, her thoughts heavy with the events of the day. But just as she was about to rise, a faint creaking sound echoed through the room. She froze, her eyes darting toward the far corner. It was the bookshelf. A single book tilted forward, as if pulled by an unseen hand. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she approached cautiously, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She reached out and pushed the book back into place, but as she did, a faint breeze brushed past her cheek, carrying with it the scent of something faintly metallic. She hesitated, her instincts prickling. "It seems," she said aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, "that this house isn't done with its secrets just yet." Cliffhanger ending. The camera pans to the bookshelf as it creaks again, the faint outline of another hidden mechanism just visible in the shadows. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience with one burning question: what other truths lie hidden in this house?